I'm going to, whenever I test features or I'm trying to learn a new tool, I like to test it on simplistic shapes. So I either use primitives or I'll draw something relatively easy to understand how the tool is working. Now the first tool is the rotation tool. I'm going to create a star because I think that describes what's happening with rotation pretty accurately, and it's also easy to understand what's going on with the object. I'm going to put a red stroke on it so that way we have better contrast on the screen so you can see it better. Now, you're probably wondering, why do we have a rotation tool if I can rotate the object through the bounding box? So right, if I go to the black arrow or my selection tool and I select the object and I hover over the corners, you'll notice that the cursor changes to this arrow that looks like it's on a little radius, right? Like it's starting to turn. So if I hold my mouse down and drag, you'll notice that it allows me to rotate the object, okay? And you'll notice as I'm doing this, if you have smart guides on, you're going to be able to see the rotation in terms of degrees, right? So it gives me a little clue in regards to what's going on with the shape. Now, how is that different than the rotation tool? Well, the rotation tool gives me more control. Basically, that's what it's going to provide. Now, as we've discussed in the past, if I want to see the options or properties for this tool, I double click on the icon and see if there's options there. That's one of the things that we would do. So I have the star selected and I'm going to double click on rotation. Now, when I go into the rotation tool, there's another feature that's activated that we didn't have with the bounding box. The other feature that's activated is that little crosshair that appears in the center of the object. This is referred to as a pivot point. So this is the center of rotation. By default, the pivot point lands in the middle of the object. But let's say I want to rotate not from the middle of the object, but maybe the point of the star. Then I can move the pivot point to that spot and then rotate from there. So there's different reasons and functions that you might want to apply in terms of illustration where you want to move the pivot point on an object for rotation. Now, a lot of the modification tools have a user interface that look like this. Now, you'll notice that I have a preview button. So I usually activate the preview when I'm about to engage with rotating my object. Now, I can rotate the object through the panel by moving this little radial wheel next to the word angle. And you'll notice that it's changing the degrees along that field. Now, I want to remind all of you that if I highlight the field, I can also move in increments of 1 by using my arrow keys, the up and down arrow key in my keyboard. Okay, here's another one for you. If you hold shift down, whoops. Oh, I thought that was going to work. I think it works with certain features, but not all. But sometimes if you hold shift and you use your arrow keys, it jumps in increments of 10. But this feature does not seem to be taking that. So, but the arrow keys seem to, work okay. See, I'm moving that 360. I hold it down. Oh, there it goes. So I'm holding shift down. Now it's increments of 10. I guess it stops at 360. That's kind of weird. Huh. All right. So there you go. Now, after I apply the modification, I have some options here. And this is something that we really need to pay attention to. I basically can say, you know what, I don't like what this is doing. It's not the right tool. I'm just going to cancel out of it. So when I cancel out, it's going to leave my object where I left it before. Now, the remaining two options besides cancel are OK. Now, if I hit OK, you'll notice that it transforms my object, which is what we would expect. But if I go back to rotation, double click on it, you'll notice that I have the ability to also select copy. So when I click on copy, you'll notice that it leaves the original and then gives me a modified version of the object as an additional item in my software in my file. So sometimes copy is really important in terms of the process that you're doing in terms of illustration. So the next tool that we're going to look at will clarify that, why we would want to make a copy. But before I move on, any questions so far about rotation? Oh, we're going to look at the pivot right now in a second. Yes, Joel?
How do you get the little dot back to the center?
So if I go to rotation, you'll notice that it sets the pivot at center. So what I do is I release the object and then go back into rotation. When you go back in, it will recenter it for you. But this is the pivot point. If I'm in the rotation tool, you'll notice in this case, I don't have the panel open. But I do have the icon selected. When I have the icon selected, I can rotate, sort of like how I did with the bounding box, right? It's very similar. But in this case, what I can do is I can also click on the crosshair, move it to a new position. Remember, I suggested the top of the star, and now the rotation is going to work along that. Okay? Yes?
If you copy it already, how can you go back to the original object?
So if I leave a copy, how do I go back to the original? So when you say go back, you want to remove the copy, or you just want to select the original object?
I just want to select it.
Okay, so her question is, if I release a copy, how do I select the original? Any advice? How do I select? Selection tool. I go to the black arrow, and then I click on the original one. Yeah, it's just like any other object. Okay, so let me undo. So let's go over the pivot again. I'm going to click on rotation. It activates the pivot. I can move. Oops. If I'm really careful, I can select the pivot, change it to a new location, and now rotation is going to happen around that. Okay. Now Joel asked, how can I get the pivot back to the center? Well, you'll notice every time I go to rotation, it resets the pivot back at the center. So it only moves it for that initial modification. Once you reactivate the tool, it recenters the pivot for you. All right, I want to show you a little hidden feature that I really love, okay? So I'm going to, in this case, go to the rotation tool, and I'm going to set the pivot at the top of the star, right? I'm setting the pivot there. And I'm going to hold the Alt key down. And this is drag and copy. So you'll notice that when I hold the Alt key down, it's saying drag and copy. So, but when I drag, it's going to drag in rotation along this pivot, right? So let's see it. See how it's dragging in rotation along the pivot, right? So when I let go, it leaves a copy that's snapped at that rotation, right? Now, there's another hidden feature that I really love as well, and that's it's a hotkey, Command D, Command D. And what Command D does is it duplicates the last thing that you did. Since I still have the object selected, it's going to duplicate the modification on this object one more time. What did I do? Remember, I activated rotation, I set the pivot, and I rotated and copied the object, and it set it here. So it's going to do that again on this object. And if I hit Command D again, it's going to do it again, and again, and again, and again. So let's see that happen. If I hit Command D, look, it just made another copy using the same variables that I used in the previous function. Command D, Command D, Command D, Command D, Command D. So you can see that I can basically create this sort of almost kaleidoscope-like effect.
So basically it's good for patterns.
Really good for patterns, or if you have objects that are sort of revolving around another object. I sort of imagine, you ever see those Mexican sombreros that have the little balls that hang off the ends? So I could illustrate one of them and use this function to make several copies running around the perimeter of the hat. Okay? Yes, Joel, hand up.
Where do you find that without the shortcut?
I don't know where it exists. I don't know where it exists. I'm sorry. I wish I could give you a more specific answer than that.
What was the button for the pivot?
What was the button for the pivot? Look, I'm undoing. So you go to rotate. Let me start from scratch. You select your object. You go to rotate. This activates the pivot point. You move the pivot point, to a new position. Right, so look, I can move the pivot point outside of the object. See, I can move the pivot point outside of the object. And if I hold Alt down, I get drag and copy. So look, there's drag and copy, right? So now if I hit Command D, there's my sequence. All right, so let me undo all that. Okay, yes.
Is the command the only work? Does it only work with the first copy? Need the second copy?
It only works off the first copy, but if you're on an object, it applies it to that. And it doesn't have to be on rotate. It can be on anything. Look, if I hold Alt and drag in this direction, right? I hit Command D, it continues to do that. Right? So Command D is just repeat what I did previously. Right? All right, so I'm going to do that. Okay, so that's the rotate tool.